An entire generation got handed the keys to the best economy in modern history, and instead of passing it on, we changed the locks. And I know exactly how it happened, because I was in the room. Not the boardroom, not the Senate floor, just an ordinary member of the generation that did it. Look at the numbers before you decide I'm exaggerating. We are the wealthiest, most educated, most comfortable generation that has ever existed on this planet, and somehow we still manage to leave the next one with more debt, fewer homes, and a shrinking middle class. That's not an accident. That's not just how economies work. That's a choice, made over and over again, by people who look a lot like me. And I'm going to walk you through exactly how we did it. Picture a card game where one player is dealt a hand with almost every winning card in the deck, plays it well for a while, and then, instead of letting the next round reshuffle fairly, quietly starts rigging the deal for every hand after theirs. That's not a metaphor for some distant historical injustice. That's a fairly accurate description of what my generation did to the one after us, in real time, while telling ourselves the whole way through that we'd simply played better. Let me confess something first. I'm not some outside commentator lecturing you from a distance. I lived every part of what I'm about to describe. I took the tax break. I voted against the apartment building down the street. I told my kids to work hard and stop complaining, right before I quietly refinanced my third property. So think of this less like an accusation, and more like a confession from somebody who was in on it. Here's the world we inherited, because it genuinely doesn't exist anymore, and a lot of young people today think I'm making it up when I describe it. Housing cost a few years of an average salary, not a decade of one. Getting a degree didn't require a loan that would follow you into your 50s. A company actually competed for workers, because there weren't 10 desperate applicants for every open role. Interest rates on savings accounts were something you could actually feel, and the idea that your children might do worse than you did would have sounded insane. We didn't just get a good starting hand. We got the best hand anyone has ever been dealt in the history of modern capitalism. And then, instead of building on it for the people coming after us, we spent it all on ourselves and called it merit. I remember buying my first place with a deposit I'd saved up, doing nothing particularly clever, just an ordinary job and a couple of years of patience. Nobody around me thought that was remarkable, because it wasn't. That was just what an entry-level life looked like back then. Try telling a 26-year-old today that a few years of an ordinary salary used to buy a home outright, and watch their face, because to them it sounds like a myth, not a memory. We didn't just get lucky once. We got lucky at every single stage of our adult lives. Cheap education, cheap housing, strong wages, generous pensions, and then a second stroke of luck stacked right on top of the first one. Decades of rising asset prices that inflated the value of the very things we happen to already own. We are, by most measures, the only generation in modern history to end up better off than both our parents and our children. Think about how strange that actually is. It didn't happen to the generation before us. It is not on track to happen to the one after us. It happened to us, uniquely, and most of us never once stopped to ask why. We just assumed it was our own brilliance. So what actually happened? Because somewhere in the middle of our working lives, we stopped asking, how do we grow the pie, and started asking, how do we protect my slice? And that shift didn't happen through some grand conspiracy. Nobody organized a meeting. It happened through thousands of small, selfish decisions that all pointed the same direction, made by people who had the votes, the wealth, and the power to make them stick. First, we blocked the housing. Every time a new apartment building, a duplex, or affordable housing development got proposed anywhere near where we lived, we showed up to the town hall meeting and killed it. We called it protecting the character of the neighborhood. What it actually protected was the value of our own homes, at the direct cost of the next generation ever being able to afford one of their own. Scarcity was never an accident. In city after city, it was the deliberate result of zoning meetings that our generation packed, and younger people never even knew were happening. Second, we let the safety net become a hammock for ourselves and a trapdoor for everyone else. Pensions that companies promised us got locked in decades ago, back when it was still cheap to offer them. Then, the moment it became expensive to keep that promise for the next generation of workers, we let companies quietly cancel it. We kept our defined pensions. The workers coming up behind us got a 401k, a shrug, and a pamphlet about personal responsibility. Third, we voted for our own tax cuts and called it economic growth. Every time capital gains taxes came up for a vote, taxes on the money made from owning stocks and property, we voted to lower them. Every time it was a choice between funding schools and infrastructure for the next generation, or cutting taxes for people who already owned assets, mostly us, we voted for the tax cut. We told ourselves it would trickle down. It trickled up instead into portfolios that we happened to be sitting on. Fourth, we financialized everything and called it innovation. Housing stopped being shelter and became an investment vehicle. Healthcare stopped being care and became a portfolio for private equity. Even higher education turned into a debt-generating machine, because once the government started guaranteeing student loans, universities realized they could raise tuition every single year with almost no consequence, and we let them, because it wasn't our tuition anymore. Fifth, we borrowed against the future and called it fiscal policy. We ran up national debt to fund tax cuts and programs that benefited us right now, while quietly assuming someone else, further down the line, would be the one paying the interest. And it turns out that someone was you. Sixth, we let deregulation turn the market into a casino and called it freedom. Guardrails that used to limit how much risk banks and investors could take got loosened, one at a time, decade after decade. Every time they were loosened, it opened up a new way for people who already had money to make more of it by trading, lending, and betting on assets, rather than by building anything real. Wages for actually doing the work barely moved for 40 years once you adjust for the rising cost of living. Meanwhile, the value of the assets we already owned kept climbing, year after year, largely untouched by any of that stagnation. We didn't build that gap on purpose, individually, but collectively. Every time we had the chance to close it and chose not to, we built it anyway. Seventh, we changed what companies were even for. For most of the century before us, a company was expected to look after its workers and its customers as much as its owners. Somewhere in the middle of our careers, that quietly flipped, and the only question that mattered became how fast the share price could climb. It got a respectable name, something that sounded almost noble. In practice, it just meant that squeezing wages, cutting benefits, and automating jobs away became something companies were rewarded for doing, because the people holding the shares, again, mostly us, benefited every time they did it. And here's the part that really stings if you sit with it. Every single one of these decisions got easier to make because we controlled the vote. Older people vote in far higher numbers than younger people, in every election, especially the local ones that actually decide zoning laws and school funding. The ones nobody young ever bothers to show up for. So the people writing the rules were, generation after generation, the people those rules protected. It wasn't a rigged system in the cartoonish sense. It was just democracy working exactly the way it works when one group shows up to vote and the other doesn't. Now let's talk about compounding, because this is the part that turns a temporary head start into a permanent, unclosable gap. Assets make more assets. Wages don't. If you own a paid-off home, you can borrow against it for a second property. That property generates rent, which buys stocks, which pay dividends, which buy more stocks. Every asset becomes a launch pad for the next one. Meanwhile, a wage just shows up again next month, the same size, while the price of the thing you're saving for keeps climbing faster than you can save. So the years we spent quietly compounding our assets in the background weren't neutral. They were actively pulling the ladder up behind us, one rung at a time, without us even needing to try. And here's a number that should make anyone in my generation a little uncomfortable. We hold the majority of the country's wealth while making up a shrinking share of the population, and the gap between what we own and what the working-age population under 40 owns has only widened every single year for the last 2 decades. It's not that young people today are lazy or bad with money, it's that they are trying to buy into a market that people my age spent 40 years quietly cornering. Take housing again, because it's the clearest single example. Households in my generation who are sitting in a home with no kids left in it, and often with the mortgage already paid off entirely, still own a huge share of the country's larger family homes. Meanwhile, the households actually raising children, the ones who genuinely need the extra bedrooms, own a noticeably smaller slice of that same housing stock. So the homes that young families need most are sitting occupied by 1 or 2 older people who have every financial incentive to stay put, and almost none to sell. And when those homes don't free up, the entire ladder underneath them jams, and first-time buyers keep drifting later and later into their lives before they can even get a foot on it. I'll be honest, I'm part of that picture too. I've got more space in my own home than I could ever reasonably use, and if I'm being completely straight with you, the only people who could realistically afford to buy it from me are other people my age. That's not a coincidence. That's the market we built, quietly closing in on itself. At this point, somebody always brings up the so-called great wealth transfer. The idea that eventually, when our generation passes on, all of this wealth flows down to our kids, and the whole problem solves itself. I understand why that sounds comforting. But I think it's mostly a fairy tale, for 2 reasons. and the whole problem solves itself. I understand why that sounds comforting. But I think it's mostly a fairy tale, for two reasons. First, a huge chunk of that wealth gets eaten up by end-of-life healthcare costs before it's ever passed down, because we also built a healthcare system that quietly bankrupts families in their final years. Second, whatever does get passed down mostly moves within families that are already comfortable. Wealthy parents, leaving assets to already comfortable kids. It doesn't spread across an entire generation. It doesn't reach the young person renting an apartment with nothing behind them and a family that never had anything to leave. So the inheritance everyone is quietly waiting for won't close the gap. It will just calcify it into permanent family lines of who has and who doesn't. Which brings me to the cleverest, and honestly the most shameful, part of the whole story. A setup this lopsided needs a cover story, something that points the blame somewhere that isn't us. And my generation built that cover story brick by brick. We told you it was about coffee. We told you it was about avocado toast, about streaming subscriptions, about how you'd have a house by now if you just stopped ordering takeout. We turned an economic structure we personally built into a referendum on your personal discipline. And it worked. Because a lot of young people today genuinely believe they are failing at something that was never actually winnable on the terms we handed them. I want to be careful here, because a lot of commentary on this topic swings too far the other way and pretends saving money is pointless, that discipline doesn't matter at all. That's not true either. If you take the money you'd spend on small daily habits and actually invest it consistently, it compounds into something real over time. Saving and investing genuinely works. But saving was never going to fix a problem where the actual target, a home, security, a stable retirement, was sprinting away from your income 6 times faster than you could save toward it. The lie was never that saving helps. The lie was that saving alone was ever going to be enough, while we quietly held on to the assets that were doing the real work in the background. Now, somebody in my generation always raises their hand at this point and says, "Not all of us got rich, so how can you blame the whole generation?" And it's a fair question, so let me actually answer it instead of dodging it. It's true that within our generation, the wealth is wildly concentrated. A small slice at the very top holds most of it, and those are the people who really engineered this system on purpose. The major property owners, the largest shareholders, the ones the whole apparatus has been quietly protecting for decades. But here's where I run out of patience for the rest of us, the ones in the middle. Even an ordinary member of my generation, someone who never got spectacularly rich, is usually sitting on a paid-off or nearly paid-off home worth several $100,000, a defined pension nobody younger will ever get, and healthcare costs that were nowhere near what today's workers face. That's not a private jet fortune. But set it next to a 28-year-old today carrying student debt, handing over half their paycheck in rent, with no realistic path to home ownership, and you start to see why "I didn't personally get that rich" isn't really the defense my generation thinks it is. We were playing on the easiest setting the modern economy has ever offered, and a lot of us still barely built anything with it, and then blamed the next generation for not doing better on hard mode. And this is the part that really gets under my skin when I hear people my age complain about younger workers. We are, statistically, the generation least likely to have started a business, least likely to have taken any real financial risk, and most likely to be sitting on unearned appreciation from a house we bought decades ago rather than anything we actually built ourselves. We didn't out-hustle anyone. We showed up early to a party that was about to get a lot more expensive, and then spent the rest of our lives congratulating ourselves for good timing as if it were talent. Nobody complains about a game they're winning, and that's just human nature, but it's worth being honest about, because not many people from my generation are willing to say it out loud. Here's the part I actually believe though, and it's the part that gives me some hope. The economy stopped rewarding effort and started rewarding ownership decades ago, and nobody handed you the new rulebook. You're not lazier than we were. You're not worse with money. You are playing an entirely different, much harder game, with the old instructions, and you've had to figure out the new rules almost entirely on your own. It is genuinely harder to save when rent eats half your income before you've spent a single dollar on anything else. It's harder to build a career when the ladder we climbed had far fewer rungs missing than the one you're facing now. And it's harder to plan a future with someone else when neither of you can afford the place you'd actually build that future in. But watch what's actually happening underneath all of this frustration, because it tells you something important. Younger generations right now are more financially literate at 25 than my generation was at 40. People are teaching themselves investing, tax strategy, and business skills online, for free, at a scale that simply didn't exist when I was your age. None of that is a coincidence. That is exactly what happens when a generation gets handed a harder game. There's an old idea worth sitting with here. Hard times create strong people create good times create weak people, and weak people create hard times. My generation was the weak people in that cycle. We got handed the good times, got comfortable, and let the hard times pile up for whoever came next to deal with. Which means the generation dealing with this mess right now is very likely building the discipline that turns into the next good era, even if it doesn't feel that way from inside it. So what do you actually do with all of this, now that you can see how the system was built? The honest, unglamorous truth is that you can't fix zoning laws or capital gains tax rates by yourself, and you shouldn't be told that your personal budgeting is a substitute for structural reform. Vote in the local elections nobody else your age bothers with, because that's literally where housing policy gets decided. Support the candidates and policies that actually build more housing and tax unearned wealth at a fairer rate, because that's the lever that moves the whole system, not the coffee you didn't buy this morning. But alongside that, understand the actual game you're being asked to play, because that part is within your control. The system rewards ownership over labor now, whether that feels fair or not, so the path forward is learning how to become an owner as early as you possibly can, even in small amounts. Learn how money, debt, taxes, and investing actually work, because almost nobody is taught this in school, and the people who understand it get a real head start over the people who don't. Start treating even small, boring amounts of money as the beginning of ownership, rather than just leftover cash. A modest amount put into a low-cost index fund every single month doesn't feel like much in year one, but given enough years to compound, it starts behaving exactly like the assets my generation has been quietly riding for decades. The difference between an earner and an owner was never really about how much money you started with, it was about how early you stopped treating saving as the finish line and started treating it as the entry ticket into owning something. Learn how to use the tools available to you right now that didn't exist for my generation. From fractional investing to building a skill or a small business almost entirely online. Because those are some of the only real on-ramps to ownership that don't require inherited wealth to get started. Focus on developing skills that either make money for a business, save money for a business, or save time for a business, because those are the skills that actually get compensated in this new version of the economy, and they're also the skills that eventually let you build something of your own, instead of only ever renting your time out to somebody else. And don't ignore how fast artificial intelligence is reshaping which of those skills are valuable, not because it's a shortcut, but because the people who understand how to use it well are going to have a real advantage over the people who dismiss it. None of this makes the situation fair, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend that individual effort alone undoes decades of structural decisions that people my age made in our own self-interest. But understanding exactly how the game was rigged is the first real advantage you have that we didn't hand you on purpose. We didn't mean to give you that, but now that you have it,